Susannah Reese had given away day-old bread to the hungry in that town for 2 years before anyone thought to call it a crime, and the woman who finally named it stood in the middle of the mercantile to do it where the whole valley could hear. It was a bright autumn morning, the kind that lies to you about how soon the cold is coming. And Susannah had only come in for a sack of flour and a tin of saleratus. She did not know that by supper half the town would have a new word for her, and that the word would be charity, said the way some people say it, so that it lands like an accusation. The woman was Imogen Crandall, the bank president's wife, who ran the church social committee the way a hard captain runs a ship, and who had decided, for reasons Susannah would not understand for a long while, that a young widow doing a dead man's trade on the main street was a thing the town would be better without. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She turned from the dry goods with a sorrowful little smile and said to the 3 women beside her, but loud enough for the room, that it was a pity. A real pity, the way the Reese woman pressed her leftover loaves on folks who could not pay, as if honest people wanted a beggar's bread, as if a woman with no husband and no sense had any business at a man's oven in the first place. Charity bread, she called it. And the word went round the room like a draft under a door. Susannah felt the heat come up her neck, and she did the thing she had taught herself in the 2 years since the fever took Daniel, which was to stand very straight and let nothing show. She had learned that a feeling shown in a public room is a feeling handed to people who have not earned it. So she finished counting her coins and picked up her flour and said, in a voice that shook only at the very end, that the bread was honest and so was she, and that she would trouble the committee for nothing at all, and walked out into the bright street with her back straight while the mercantile stored it up to chew on later. Here is the thing the town did not trouble to know about the bread it had just decided to despise. Susannah Reese did not bake charity. She baked because it was the one thing left in the world she was sure she was good at. And she gave away what did not sell because she could not stand the thought of bread going hard in a basket while a rail hand 3 doors down ate cold beans alone. Her husband Daniel had opened that shop with his own 2 hands and his own borrowed money. And when the fever took him in the wet end of a winter 2 years gone, it had left her the oven, the debt, and the recipe ledger, and not one thing else. She had kept all 3 alive, and the town had never bothered to look at how hard. The squat brown crock sat where it had always sat, on the corner of the worktable, and the first thing she did every morning, before the lamp, before anything, was lift the wooden lid and feed it. It was a sourdough starter, a soft, pale ferment that raised every loaf she made, and it was the oldest thing she owned. Her grandmother had carried it west, wrapped in a wet cloth inside her coat so the cold would not kill it, and it had been alive longer than the town had a name. You fed it and kept it from freezing. And in return it gave you bread when the store yeast failed and the weather turned, which on that high plain it always eventually did. By the next morning the whole town had the story, polished and improved in the telling, that the Reese woman had been handing out beggars' loaves and giving herself airs about it, and that Imogen Crandall had put her in her place, and high time, too. The talk found its way to the church social committee, which met that week to lay out the harvest fair, the bright gathering at summer's end where the whole valley came to eat and trade and judge each other's pies and bread. For 3 years running Susannah's bread had sat on that table. This year, with Imogen at the head of it and a pen in her hand, the committee found a dozen gentle reasons to keep the baking among the church families, drew a firm line through her name, and told themselves it was decency. And the rail line, which had bought her bread for its cruise because it was good and cheap and there before dawn, heard that the baker had become a matter of some controversy, and quietly gave the contract to a supplier 2 stops down, because a railroad does not like controversy any more than a banker's wife does. So in the span of 1 week, a woman who had been merely poor became poor and disgraced both, which are different weights entirely, and the second is far heavier than the first. Susannah did the only thing she knew how to do. She got up the next morning in the cold dark and lit the lamp and lifted the wooden lid off the brown crock and fed it. Because a living thing does not care whose name is on a committee list. She did not weep. She shaped her loaves and set them to rise, and when the gray light came, she opened the door of a shop that fewer and fewer people felt free to be seen walking into. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories. The ones where nobody is saved by luck or by money, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company in the evenings, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Susannah is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, which is that the people a town decides to look past are almost always the ones holding it up from underneath, and that it sometimes takes one quiet soul willing to be seen doing the unpopular kindness to remind a whole street of what it had forgotten about itself. The quiet soul, as it happened, worked across the street and 4 doors down at the forge, and his name was Jonah Tice. He was the town blacksmith, a big weathered man in his middle 30s who had said perhaps 40 words to Susannah Reese in the 2 years they had been near neighbors, most of them about weather. He was a widower, too, though the town had long stopped thinking of him that way. His wife had died young, years back, and Jonah had folded himself down small around the loss and gone quiet. Until quiet was simply the thing people knew about him, and they mistook it for cold. He had decided a long time ago that the safest thing to do with what he felt was keep it banked low and let his hands do the talking, because hands could be trusted not to say too much. He had been standing in the doorway of the forge the morning Susannah walked out of the mercantile with her face carefully empty, and he had heard, as most of the street had heard, what Imogen Crandall said inside, and watched the young widow carry her flour home alone past people who looked at their boots rather than at her. And something in him, some old banked coal, had turned over. He knew what it was to be the thing a town had quietly agreed to feel sorry for and step around. The next morning, when Susannah set her basket of unsold loaves out on the bench by her door the way she always did, Jonah Tice put down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron and crossed the street. He did not make a speech. He came into the small warm shop where Susannah stood behind her flour-dusted counter, braced for whatever fresh unkindness the day meant to bring, and took off his flat wool cap, and asked, in his low, unhurried way, what she got for a loaf. She told him the price of a fresh one. He nodded, slow, and set a single coin down on the counter between them, and said he would take a day-old one off the bench, because he had heard a deal of foolishness in this town lately and wanted to pay full price for something honest while he still could. It was not much, a coin and a few plain words from a man who found the words harder to spend than the coin. But he did it standing in her open doorway with the bright street behind him, where the mercantile porch and Imogen Crandall's parlor window and the whole watching town could see exactly who had crossed to the disgraced widow's shop and exactly what he thought of their new word for her. Susannah looked at the big, quiet man turning his cap in his soot-marked hands, and for the first time in a week, something in her chest came loose enough to let her breathe. She wrapped his loaf in paper and pressed a second one on top that she would take no coin for, and told him it was not charity, it was the baker's right to give away her own bread. And he could argue about it with someone who had the time. The corner of Jonah's mouth moved, which on him was very nearly a laugh, and he took both loaves and went back across the street to his fire. If you've made it this far into Susannah's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He came back the next morning. and the morning after that. Some days he only asked whether the oven was drawing right, and some days he sat a quarter hour on the tall stool by the front window with a day-old loaf and a tin cup of coffee she would not let him pay for, a big, still presence that somehow made the small shop feel less like a place under siege. And here is what the town noticed, because a town always notices that wherever Jonah Tice put his quiet weight, the unkindness could not quite hold its shape. People who would happily have crossed the street to avoid the charity-bred widow found it harder with the blacksmith in her window, a man owed money by half the men in the valley, and not to be sneered at the way a lone woman could. One by one, a few began to come back. Old Asa Penn, who cooked for the rail crew and had never stopped buying from her on the quiet, started buying out loud. The widow, Pearl Dabney, who feared no committee on this earth, took to stopping in of a morning to ask Susannah whether she had eaten, which was Pearl's way of declaring whose side she was on. The work after that began to braid the two of them together, slow, the way work does. The oven door had hung crooked for a year, dropping its heat, and one evening Jonah simply appeared with his tools and knelt and mended the iron hinge while Susannah shaped the morning's loaves 3 feet away. The two of them working in an easy quiet that neither remarked upon and both noticed. He fixed the latch on the back door that had not latched true since Daniel died. And Susannah, who had no coin to pay him and would not have insulted him by trying, paid him the only way two such people had, with bread and with a hot plate set quietly at his elbow when he worked past supper. She learned he took his coffee black and bitter and reached first for the dark rye. He learned she rose in the absolute dark. That the lamp in her window was the first light lit on the whole street every single morning, without one day's exception, and that she fed that brown crock before she fed herself. He learned, watching her stand straight through a season designed to bend her, that he had badly misjudged what quiet was for. He had used his own silence to hide a wound. She used hers to protect a strength. And somewhere in the watching, the old banked coal he had kept so carefully low for so many years began, against all his intentions, to give off heat. He asked once what was in the brown crock, and when she told him it was her grandmother's start, older than both of them put together, carried across the plains inside a coat. He looked at it the way another man might look at an old family portrait and said that was worth more than most things people called valuable. Susannah understood then that this was a man who knew the difference between what is precious and what is merely expensive, and that there were very few such people in the world, and that she had somehow ended up sharing a quiet shop with one of them. Imogen Crandall did not care for the way the wind was shifting. She had expected the charity-bred widow to be gone by now, sold up and slunk back east, and instead the woman was still there every morning with her lamp lit first on the street, the town blacksmith in her window, and Pearl Dabney telling anyone who would hold still that Susannah Reese baked the best bread in 3 counties and always had. So Imogen did what a certain kind of person does when a cruelty has not finished its work, and tightened it. Word began to go round, gentle as ever, that perhaps there was something unseemly in the arrangement, a widow and a widower and a shop and all those early hours, and that decent folk could not be expected to overlook it. It was a meaner thing than the first, because it reached for the one thing Susannah had left, which was her good name, and it reached for Jonah too, who had done nothing but mind his work and be kind once, in public, to someone who needed it. It landed harder than the first. There were mornings now the shop sat empty an hour at a stretch, and the money came slower. And worse than the money was the doubt it planted in Susannah herself, late at night, the question of whether she had any right to the warmth that had crept into her days, whether wanting the big quiet man to keep crossing the street was a betrayal of the husband in the ground. She did not feed her doubt where Jonah could see it, but she felt it, and it sat on her chest in the dark. It was the recipe ledger that opened the way through. She had been hunting a method she half remembered, a dark sour rye Daniel used to make for the cold months, and one wet afternoon with the shop empty she took down the worn leather ledger he had kept and went through it page by page, his cramped, careful hand on every leaf. The years of their marriage written out in flour and salt and rising times, and folded into the very back of it, behind the last recipe, in an envelope gone soft at the creases with her own name on the front in his fading hand, she found a letter. She knew at once when he had written it. The hand was the unsteady hand of his last winter, and she understood that he had written it knowing, and folded it where he knew she would one day go looking, and never said a word. She sat down on the flour sack by the window and read it in the gray light, and her hands were not steady. Daniel had written that the cough had got into him deeper than he let on, but that whatever came he had made his peace with it, and that the only thing that robbed him of peace was the thought of what he was leaving her, the debt and the cold oven and the hard town, a burden no man should hand the woman he loved. And then he had written the thing that broke her open. The shop was never the thing worth keeping, he wrote. The starter is. Your grandmother's start, the living thing, the thing that feeds people. That is what I am proudest we ever had under this roof, and you are its keeper now, and you are better at this than I ever was. So feed them anyway. Let the small-minded say what they will, and feed them anyway. Because that is who you are, and I will not have this place make you smaller. And then, at the very end, in a line that must have cost the dying man something to set down, he had written, You are too young and too good to keep a cold hearth for my sake. When a good man finally crosses that street to you, and one will, do not make him ask twice. Live, Susannah. That is the only thing I want that I cannot give you myself. She wept then, the way she had not let herself weep in 2 years, not in the street and not on any of the hard nights, but here, alone, with her husband's last kindness in her hands. He had not used his final strength to apologize or to cling. He had used it to hand her her own life back. The dead man had reached up out of the ground and named the thing she and Jonah had been circling for weeks, too proud and too grieved and too watched to say, and told her plainly that she was allowed. She did not run across the street that night and throw the letter at Jonah Tice's feet, but something in her uncrossed its arms. The next morning when he came in out of the cold and took the stool by the window, she set his black coffee down and stood a moment with her hand on the counter near his, closer than she ever had, and did not move it away. And he looked at her hand and then at her face. And neither of them said one word, and everything was said. After that, the quiet between them was no longer the quiet of two careful strangers, but of two people who have decided something and are content, for now, to let the doing of the days say it for them. The harvest fair came at the turn of the season, the whole valley pouring onto the green with its wagons and its bunting and its long plank tables, the committee's bread laid out in the place of honor where Susannah's had sat for 3 years and would not sit this year. Imogen Crandall presided over it in her fine plum dress, gracious and certain. The matter of the charity-bred widow as good as settled in her mind. But the weather, which lies to no one for long on that high plain, had turned hard in the night. A black frost had come down without warning and got into the crocks of store-bought yeast all over town, and that yeast, a finicky-bought thing with no deep roots, had sulked and died in the cold. So when the committee's loaves came out onto the table that bright fair morning, they came out flat. Pale, close, heavy, a whole table of good church-wives' bread that had simply refused to rise. Susannah had not been asked to bring a thing. But Pearl Dabney and old Asa Penn had hauled her down against her protests with 2 great baskets in Asa's wagon. Because Pearl did not hold with letting a good woman hide on a day made for eating. And Susannah's bread had risen. Of course it had. She had raised it as she raised every loaf on her grandmother's living starter, the squat brown crock she had kept feeding faithfully through every insult the town had thrown, the wild, hardy thing that did not know how to care about a frost or a committee. While every other loaf on the judging table lay flat and pale, hers stood tall and golden enough to feed the whole gathered valley. And the valley, which had come a long way to eat and found nothing else worth eating, gathered around her 2 baskets. There was no speech. That is not how it goes in a place like that. The town simply ate. Rail hands and church wives and the men who had given her husband's contract away, all of them lining up a little sheepish for the charity bread widow's bread, because it was the only bread on the green with any life in it, and finding it was the best thing they had put in their mouths all year. Imogen Crandall stood at the head of her flat and ruined table and watched the whole valley turn, quiet and hungry, toward the woman she had tried to drive out, and found that she had, all at once, urgent business at the far end of the green. She was not jeered. No one needed to. A town that has just watched the person it despised feed it with both hands does its own slow arithmetic, and is never quite able to say the cruel word again with the old confidence. And that is a harder thing to live with than any insult. Jonah Tice came and stood beside Susannah at her baskets, close, in front of the whole staring valley, the first time he had ever put himself plainly at her side where every soul in 3 counties could see it. He picked up a loaf and tore it and ate it where he stood, and then said, in his low voice, but not so low that the nearest of them could not hear, that this was the best bread in the valley and always had been, and that the man who got to sit in this woman's window of a morning was the luckiest fool in the county, and that he intended to keep right on being him if she would have it. It was for Jonah Tice a flood of words, and it cost him visibly. And Susannah Reese laughed out loud for the first time in 2 years, with flour on her hands and the whole town watching, and said he could keep the stool by the window for good if he liked, and she would even stop trying to make him pay for the rye. They married in the early winter, when the first clean snow lay on the valley and the bakery windows steamed gold against the dark afternoons. Most of the town came, a little sheepish still, the way people are when they have been wrong out loud and been fed anyway. Pearl Dabney brought 3 pies, and the only question that ever truly mattered, which was whether everyone had eaten. And old Asa Penn gave the bride away. Susannah wore a plain blue dress she had sewn herself, and Jonah stood beside her scrubbed and uncomfortable and happier than the town had seen him in a decade, and on the table beside the cake, where another couple might have set flowers, sat the squat brown crock with its wooden lid. Because Susannah said the oldest living thing in her keeping ought to be at the wedding too. She had been 26, a widow with a cold oven and a dead man's debt, and a town that had decided to look past her, when the fever took Daniel and left her nothing but a recipe ledger and a crock of living dough. She grew old on that main street beside the quiet man who crossed it for her. The shop warm and full, the lamp in her window still the first lit on the street every single morning of her life, and the valley that had called her bread charity came in the end to call her by her name and forget it had ever wanted her gone. On the last evening of this story the light went down gold and quiet over the snowy little town, and an old man and an old woman closed up the shop together, and the brown crock sat open on the counter in the low gold light, fed and covered for the morning, a small portion of it wrapped and waiting by the door, a start for a young couple 2 streets over who had asked the famous baker how a body kept a thing alive across the generations. Daniel's recipe ledger sat on the shelf where it had always sat, the husband who was lost and the love that was found keeping their own steady places under one warm roof. Kindness, it turns out, is not a thing you can shame out of a person worth the name. It is a living thing, and it outlasts the frost, and it feeds whoever is hungry long after the people who sneered at it have gone quiet. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low. When the world decides to call your kindness a weakness and tries to make you ashamed of it, do you fold it away small and safe to spare yourself the talk? Or do you go on feeding people anyway and trust that the right soul will cross the street to you in the end? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.